Kia ora tātou. Today's the second lecture in Health in the Digital Era. There will be 3 separate recordings for today. The first is this one, which is going to cover some key terms starting out in digital health. The second one covering some key background for digital health, and then there's a third one on key issues in digital health. So make sure that you make time to watch all 3 of these. So as we go through the paper, I'm going to introduce some key terms each week. The point of doing this isn't that I want you to memorize a list. It's really just making sure that everyone in the paper's on the same page, so we sort of have a shared vocabulary, and when a term gets used, that we all sort of more or less understand what it's about. So the first of these terms is Web 2.0, and that describes the current era of internet, where instead of having static web pages that have pre-filled or pre-established content, we have dynamic content and a lot of user-generated content. So the internet, when I was at high school in the 1990s and through the early 2000s, was relatively static. You would get encyclopedias putting their information online. You'd get some companies putting information online. But it was quite hard for everyday internet users to create their own content and upload their own data. And what the shift to Web 2.0 indicated was the shift which made it much easier and quicker for anyone at all who had internet access to upload and create content. And so this is where we start to talk about things like blogs and social media such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, Pinterest, and so on. And there are literally hundreds of millions of people every day uploading to these platforms, and that is the user-generated content. So there's a massive increase in size of information on the internet, and the source of it is coming from users. Second key term is the Internet of Things. Now this is referring to the increasing interconnectivity of different devices via the internet, which allows automated and remote functions. So a really mundane example is that heat pumps now often come with an app on your phone, and you can so your heat pump is connected to your internet at home, and you can then control say the heat pump in your lounge. So if you leave work at 5 o'clock and it's going to take you half an hour to get home, you can set your heat pump as you leave work so that your lounge is cool when you get home. And you might say, well, that's pointless because you could just set it to come on at 5 o'clock every day, or maybe you don't finish work at the same time every day, and so that pre-programming's not kind of so useful. The Internet of Things also has relevance for medical devices. So for example, there might be a measuring device which wirelessly or using Bluetooth will upload to a phone or directly to the internet. And once it's up in the cloud, that data then might get provided immediately to a medical care provider, a carer, a parent, any of those sorts of things. And we'll look at a really cool example of this later in semester. Our other 2 key terms for today are equity and the digital divide. So equity is a view of justice and fairness that is focused on achieving similar, that is equitable, outcomes for all people. So when we talk about equality, equality was a term that was used really widely through the 20th century for things and prior for things like ending slavery, the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, which was sort of from the 1950s through to early 1990s. And it was arguing that in law, we need to give all people the same rights. Everybody needs to have the same right to access education, healthcare, and the same right to access different facilities. So in the United States, with Jim Crow laws, as they're called in the southern United States, there were white-only shops. There were seats on buses that only white people were allowed to use. And in South Africa with apartheid, there were beaches that black people weren't allowed to access to swim, and blacks and whites were literally forced to live in separate parts of town, in cities, and the living conditions for the blacks were far and away worse. It was active discrimination. So equality was the term that we used, or was used then, to argue for what should be provided to all people. No one should be forced to live in a ghetto and not be allowed to live somewhere else. No one should not be allowed to go to this particular beach. No one should have to give up their seat on a bus because someone of a different skin colour wants it. And so it was a really important concept. And since this equality has been achieved to varying extents, to a certain extent it's been achieved, what has been recognised is that people who previously were seen as being treated unequally, some of that unequal treatment has been removed in terms of legal discrimination. However, they're still experiencing massive inequities in terms of employment, health, education, and so on. And so the argument for equity is trying to identify the factors in society that prevent particular groups of people from having the same chances of success as sort of the dominant group or the more powerful group within society. And this is just as important in New Zealand as it is in the case of South Africa or America, which are the two examples that I've used. I'll pick up on equity again when we get to sort of some key background for the paper. So a related notion to equity is the digital divide. And this is describing the gap between those people who have the resources to access the internet and digital technologies and those who don't have the resources to access the internet and digital technologies. So if we're increasingly reliant on digital technologies in everyday life and for health-related reasons, then if people don't have access to those, they're fundamentally going to have poorer outcomes than the rest of the population. And so we need to be really wary of this, that we know that in most countries, New Zealand included, there is not equal access to digital technologies and to the internet. And yet, daily life is increasingly structured around having access to the internet. And so what I mean is we pay bills online, we might get customer support with a service provider such as internet or phone, water, power, interact with a city council or a regional council. Increasingly, these things are most efficiently and effectively done online. So if people don't have access to the internet, then they're missing out on those efficient forms of communication. Yes, they might still be able to deal with these things over the phone, but increasingly that's a less effective way of interacting with an organisation, whether that's governmental or a private company. So we need to be really wary that if we're trying to solve health problems using digital technologies, we don't take into account the fact that there is unequal access to these technologies. We mightn't actually be helping the people who most need it.